Hello, Greg Hodge.
Hi, Richard. How you going?
Very well, thank you. Delighted to be talking with you. And your exhibition is every day at Sullivan and Strump in Sydney. And although, in fact, the exhibition is in Sydney, you are sitting there right at the moment in Paris, or in France anyway, in your home there at the moment, and we'll talk a little bit about that once we start to have chance for a chat. As usual, let me remind the viewer that the whole idea with these interviews is to go to the gallery website, find the exhibition, find the images of the works, and hopefully be able to have a look at that exhibition at the same time as you listen to the conversation that Greg and I have. That's the best way to get the best value out of it. Greg, well, there you are in France. First of all, how was the residency? Because this all stemmed from a residency that you got in Paris.
It did, yeah. So the residency was through the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It was the Denise Hickey Memorial Studio, which is a studio that the Art Gallery have the Cite Internationale in Paris, and they award to artists on a kind of, I think it's like a 3-month cycle. So I think maybe 4 artists a year from Australia take on the residency. And I was fortunate enough to start the residency in October 2019 and in fact extend my stay at the Cite for an extra couple of months. So all up, my residency was approximately about 5 months at the Cite, which was a really a nice amount of time to kind of build something a bit more resolved, in fact.
And so for those who might not be familiar with the facilities, literally the physical environment of the Cite, when you get a residency at the Cite, what do you actually get as an artist? What's your working environment?
Sure. Well, I guess first and foremost, what you get is a really quite a good, modest, a generous actually scale working studio that you normally can live and work there. It's right in the middle of the city, which is really, I guess, unique in, having a generous sized space studio anywhere in any capital city, sort of in the middle, is quite rare. So that's a really fortunate opportunity. My circumstances are, my wife Claire, who who's also an artist. We have 2 children, so we were living. We have been kind of living not in the studio, so it was very much just used as a kind of turn up and work studio. And both, actually, it was big enough for both Claire and I to be working in that studio for the time, which has been really fortunate. The studio space is also part of a huge network. It's probably at any given time across 2 different venues in Paris of the Cite. There's up to about 150 artists, international artists at one time. Performing artists, musicians, visual artists. And so there's an opportunity to kind of develop an international kind of community around your own work and around the work of others while you're there. You're kind of encouraged to, kind of set up a bit of a community, I suppose.
It's a wonderfully fertile environment for creative ideas and creative production. And in your case, very specifically, you produced an entire exhibition, which is the exhibition at Sullivan and Strump in Sydney, called Every Day. Was that a reflection of what was happening? Was the title a reflection of your everyday experience?
Well, it was actually, Richard. It's interesting because the title, it was something, I mean, firstly what it was it was a reflection before the COVID lockdown here, which I'm sure we'll get into, which we're coming kind of to the end out of in Paris, kind of slowly, unfortunately. The title was a kind of reflection on this, just the ritual of needing to get to the studio every day from my apartment to the Cite, amongst this these other uncertainties that we were going through in terms of like setting up a family in a new city. The studio was this thing that I knew really well, like, going through the motions of making work. I found it, even though it was a new space, I kind of just would go in there every day to kind of make something. And I guess it was like a really basic reflection on that. As it turns out, it's also thinking about our sort of 2 months of confinement where I wasn't working after the show was painted, after all that work was painted, and we were going through a kind of like routine at home with our kids every day. And that was, we're kind of, you learn a lot from that, right? Like that was like
Indeed. That combined environment, and particularly as you mentioned, the international artist stimulation of being at the Cite. Did you have a sense of that producing or triggering or moving you towards significant evolutionary changes in your work, or was it very much just work as normal?
I think the work as normal came. It was both. I think it's funny. I think there's probably a kind of a nervous tick that I developed to just have to like produce all the time. I don't work just towards shows. For example, I will try and like work all year in the studio consistently. So try and build something up that then can be placed somewhere down the track. I had originally wanted to use the time in a less kind of making way and more in a research orientated way, like think about, doing some research, reading and writing perhaps, but the studio itself is really conducive to making work. So when I got there, it was a really natural thing for me. It was like, well, I had brought some materials and I thought I just need to work. And the new show, there's these shifts in the work that some look a little larger than I feel they are, but they're definite shifts and made, I think, specific shifts that probably needed to happen in a new environment. I think when you make work in a new environment, it's a really good opportunity to kind of make things that you don't really know what they are. And there's some paintings in the new show that I definitely felt like I wasn't, in terms of fully understanding what they are. When you make something new, you're still trying to get to know it. Or it's a very fresh thing. So I think,
sorry to interrupt.
Definitely the new work and making these maybe new shifts. I think it was really important that I did that in a new environment. Yeah.
Let's go to some of the works, and let's start with one with the title Conversation. Because there does seem in that and in a number of the other works to be a conversation, a dialogue, maybe even a collision between some of those mobile paint forms and more representative seeming or representative founded backgrounds, and conversation certainly seems to be one of those. Can you tell us what's happening there and what sort of conversation you see going on?
Yeah. So that painting, I guess there's three paintings that I think are real anchors in the whole show that have a strong sense of perhaps a narrative scene that has been constructed. And then in front of that scene are these abstract illusionistic gestural marks that I guess people are probably more familiar, who know my work, are more familiar with that kind of visual language. Firstly, I guess the narrative that is a constructed one that I kind of made up. What I would do is I would make drawings and take images of my studio, like furniture, and make up kind of spaces that look like architectural spaces. Extract kind of references to figuration and pattern. There's like pattern carpet. There's sort of architectural elements, and then make these in a kind of drawing and collage form. And then the way that they're painted, the way that those backgrounds are painted, really stem from an interest in how representational, like figurative tapestries, specifically tapestries that I was looking at, 17th century tapestries, are made from often a cartoon or actually a Renaissance painting perhaps, and they're kind of transformed into a woven tapestry. And I was really fascinated even before I got here, but even thinking about some of the research that I would do into the ways in which there's a kind of illusion I could see going on in these tapestries, unlike kind of painting. So I think if we think about the way that a painting, when it's made, it physically sits on the surface of the material of the support. But what was really exciting about the tapestries is that the image is somehow like embedded within the weft and the warp and weave of the actual material. And so what I was thinking about was, I'm always really interested in this idea of paint mimicking other surfaces. So I've always done, looked at ways in which I can mimic other material surfaces in paint, I guess. And I got really excited about the potential of creating paintings, creating surfaces that mimicked a kind of a tapestry or a textile with kind of interwoven imagery. So it was this really complex system that I tried to develop. And then, of course, on top of that are these gestures that sit on top, and they veil everything. So I guess the role of the gestural mark, it's to kind of create a sense of maybe unease in what is actually happening on the surface. What is there a scene behind that's being covered up? They create I guess it's another element, I guess.
It's interesting because actually that word conversation, if I'm right, seems to have as part of its representational background, part of a work that is also one of your other works in the exhibition. It's almost as though that other work is in the background of conversation, as though it's just propped up against the wall.
It is, and what that is it's all that is there's a bit of doubling, and that's happened across a couple of the paintings. I guess that's a way for me to generate imagery from something that I've already made, if that makes sense. So the painting, I think it's called, it's a painting called Body. And then what I've done is, in the painting of conversation, I've just sort of flipped it and it's sitting in the background. And what it does is it sort of like, it becomes a part of that image. But if you, I guess in the show, they weren't hanging together. I think we had the painting Body kind of on another wall, but it's sort of it reminds you of, it's sort of this mirroring, doubling thing that, that's the first time that's come up. I was waiting for someone to kind of point that out. No one else has pointed that out yet. So that's great.
Oh, no, look, because Body, which I would like to talk about a little bit later, is such a different work. You know, perhaps even referential, now that you've mentioned that fascination with tapestry and fabric. In some of the works that we'll talk about shortly, there's almost a sense of painted fabric, of stretched fabric, of things stitched together. But we'll come to that shortly, because I am interested in when you were talking about paint mimicking surfaces, and also mimicking, often very deliberately, a sense of three-dimensionality. You seem fascinated with the gestural mobile paint forms to create that sense of a really interesting illusion. How did that particular form, which, as you say, is one that people will know well who followed your work, how did that actually develop?
Yeah, so I mean, I can kind of I can trace that back to, like, I guess, a fairly specific period. I've been using this idea of the gestural mark, and I think about it very much as a kind of an illusionistic mark. It's not a mark that I see as being. We often think about gestural painting as being kind of quick and an immediate thing, and a kind of painting that is like, if we think about abstract expressionism, for example, it was about this like bodily experience where the painter made a painting very quick and the marks were generated in this kind of speed.
Sort of spontaneous and without a sense of control. But what your marks quite clearly seem to have are the illusion of gesture, but they're incredibly controlled and incredibly structured.
Yeah. So what they are is, in fact, they're made kind of the complete opposite of that kind of spontaneous gesture. They're built up. The surfaces have to be prepared really intentionally, and that's quite laborious in terms of generating, especially on a large scale, making sure that the surface is prepared for this, for the gesture. And then they're often made first smaller. So we'll make a smaller gesture and then kind of rehearse that gesture and build brushes to accommodate, you know, say if it's a bigger scale, make sure that the brushes are going to do what they need to do. And so often I see them as being, they have this whole lineage of rehearsal that happens before they're made. They're made to, I guess they're made to look at once as if they've, I think of them, and I've said this before, as if they've just kind of like flown in, they've just kind of come in from somewhere else. But to do that, they've needed to be, it's very contrived, like it's very considered how they get there. So yeah, there's been a kind of evolution of that mark. I actually have a kind of database now of marks that I've used that are like, it's just a digital database. So I know, so I can just kind of like recall gestural marks, and they're used. So, I can go back and say, for example, there might be a gesture in this show that is from an earlier series of paintings I made like 3 years ago. And that often happens a lot. Like there's a kind of recall of something similar that's happened in other paintings. They then take on a different form, and they might take on structurally they're a little bit different. But that mark, I guess, also, and the way that it sits on the surface is often it's with, it has a shadow, so it has a painted cast shadow that makes it look as if it's not actually sitting on the same surface as the painting.
Well, let's go to another work, which is called Mask, which in many ways is a very straightforward representation of that complex process. It's a very beautifully graded, but essentially a graded blue background, and then these very energetic, complex, seemingly spontaneous forms very carefully placed, and with a tremendous amount of very carefully worked three-dimensional illusion in them. Is the title really, in a sense, what they're about? They are these masking, illusionistic gestures.
Yeah, the title was interesting because it looked like the way that sometimes I title work, it can be really intentional, and sometimes it needs to be like, it's a way of separating work from another work. But with Mask, it was, if you look at the way that the gestures have they're all quite frontal, and they looked a little like they were kind of even like shielding a face or something like that. I thought that was, like obviously totally unintentional. Think about the situation that we're in now. I thought that was quite strange, like we're all here walking around wearing masks at the moment. But yeah, that idea of, I guess, what's that painting shows, it's a much more straightforward intent, in that there's gestures and a kind of atmospheric ground, and the gestures appear to kind of hover over an atmospheric ground. They're made in a way, how that's constructed is, I guess, there's a plan that's a collage that's made first. The gestures are in fact the thing that happens at the very first thing. The gestures have to happen first, and then they're all completely masked off, and then the ground is happening at the end. And then there's a flipping that happens, so it looks as if things are on top, but they're actually underneath.
I'm sure probably quite a few people have tried to reverse engineer what it is that you do. And I mean, it's fascinating to speculate, but really one shouldn't get into that too much. It's just great to see the final result. And let's go to that other work, or some of the other works, but you were referring specifically to the work Body. And as I commented, it seems to have a sense almost of fabric reference, of being stitched together. And there are 2 or 3 other similar feeling works that feel very different to the gestural pieces. Talk a little bit more about Body and that decision to, well, I suppose perhaps represent fabric, if that's what you're doing. What is happening there?
Those paintings, and I think we're referring to, probably there's 3 or 4. There's Body, Stacks, and a couple of others that are purely just almost like geometric constructions of these illusionistic sense of textile. and often a kind of geometric coming together of one color against another.
Yes.
Look like the stitching of fabric. Yeah, they were very much. They were made quite early, actually. They were made before the bigger paintings in the residency, and I guess those paintings I see as the freshest in the show. They're the ones that I feel where I was sort of asking a lot of questions on the surface, if that makes sense. So trying to work out how to generate these surfaces that I referred to earlier as kind of mimicking a tapestry or mimicking a textile. I've always been interested in kind of the modernists such as Le Corbusier, Sophie Taber-Arp, Ferdinand Leger, whose works were actually, who were painters, but they also had works translated as tapestries. And I'd seen these kind of geometric tapestries here in Paris and wanted to kind of, they're definitely a kind of reference to that period of abstract paintings being translated into a woven surface. And I wanted to make them with, as I guess, even though they're kind of complex in the way that they're constructed, they don't have this heavily, there's not those like stacked layered surfaces like the other paintings that we're referring to, like a conversation. I wanted them to be stripped back of that for me to kind of get a sense of actually how to generate those illusions, if that makes sense.
Although I thought it was interesting that even with those around the edge of the works, from what I could see on the website, you had still made it look as though those works were kind of just floating on the edge of the actual canvas, or floating just above the canvas with a little shadow below it.
Yeah, and they have these. They also have kind of holes. They're like in the corners, and they're just kind of as if they've been cut away. So they're kind of negatives, and that again was sort of. I remember making that, and it was literally a question of how do I kind of finish these? Where does the edge? What do I do with the edges? And the parameters of a painting's always been something really, where a painting stops, or what you do with a corner has always been really something I've thought about always. And
we can actually see that in the painting that is behind you. I presume you're in your apartment at the moment, but we can see those circles, those small holes in the corner, and that sort of sense of creating an edge within an edge on the canvas.
Yes, yeah, and they just, it was again that came out of, I guess. I was thinking about this previously. A lot of the decisions that I make in terms of paintings often happen on the surface of a painting. So the way that I think about research for a work is often I'll need to generate a number of things first, whether they be small paintings or paintings like this. And sometimes they can at first feel unresolved. Like I think that that group of paintings that Body is part of felt at first sort of like, I treated it initially like maybe a work on paper, like a question, if that makes sense. But then as everything else progressed, they actually started to form a dialogue with everything else. And they're kind of much more stripped back compositions, I thought, blended nicely with everything else that's a bit more complex.
Just going now to your present life in France, as you say, it's coming towards a process of some of the restrictions rolling back a bit in Paris. What is life for you in the immediate future there, and what are the plans?
Well, we've had a chance to, Claire and I have had a chance to kind of reflect on the last couple of months. Confinement was, as you know, France was hit, really badly, and we in a lot of ways, we felt like we've been really fortunate, and we had a really good setup here. Like we've got a long-term rental on a good apartment. We have our, it was a battle of attrition really with our two kids to keep them busy. But that was something, that we learned a lot, and there was we feel, I guess, coming out of it, that we've been really fortunate in some ways to go through something like that. Our situation is that we've got a long-term, we're on a long-term artist visa. So that means that we're able to be here for a longer period. So our apartment is in, for those that know Paris, it's in Bastille, which is just in the 11th, which is only kind of 15 minutes from where the Cite is, and we needed somewhere close when the residency was on. Our two children are actually they're in school and creche here, which is an amazing thing. Like that they're in the system here, and they're back at school this week, which is really exciting. And Claire and I we have a studio in the south of Paris. So our studio is a 20-minute bike ride away from where we live, and we've been in there for 2 weeks. So we've been back in the studio for about 2 weeks.
Now, for anyone who may not know Claire, your partner, your wife, Claire is Claire Thackway, a very fine Australian painter. And in the past, you and Claire have from time to time collaborated with some wonderful works. Any chance of that happening while you're there in Paris?
Yes, and we did think about it, and Claire's got plenty on at the moment, actually. So we often find that the collaboration process, which we haven't kind of committed a heap of time to recently, we need to find a time where we both have a bit of a parallel break in our programming or schedules. But I guess, the thing is, Richard, also what's been really awesome is that we've been making work in these same studios now since we've been here, and that's both been a practical solution to needing studio space in a city that's like really expensive, but also it's been really nice to like both try to make new things to new space. And there's always these like interesting crossovers that happen. I think when you make work with anybody in proximity, and that's something, there's always a painting dialogue that happens with Claire and I, regardless of a physical collaboration.
Well, they sound like exciting times and times full of potential, even though, of course, in the COVID world, they've been very challenging times. And I should just mention in passing for anyone who might be watching this interview a little further down the track, we're talking right at the beginning of June in 2020. So maybe we should just put that little bit of time scale in there. But look, it has been fantastic to talk with you, and I hope that the possibilities that you talk about go forward in all sorts of very productive ways. So, Greg Hodge, thanks very much for sharing your exhibition with us.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Great to catch up.